Hi, my name is Alex, and on this episode of Magic Missile Minis, I'm going to be sculpting another member of my D&D party. On this episode, we're going to be sculpting Jack, the Gnome Sorcerer. So, to start, I cut out a small piece of wire, about 5 centimeters, and fold it in half to make the armature. Pinching it between some pliers and spinning it a little bit to create the torso of our mini. I then go ahead and fold out the legs and cut out another piece of wire that I can use for the arms, clamping on the arms with some needle nose pliers. Once I've finished the armature, I can go ahead and begin to pose it. Planning on having him kind of be jumping backwards on one foot and having him cast a spell. I then go ahead and place him on one of my bottles that I use as a sculpting handle. Here's the armature next to another miniature just to show how tiny this mini I'm making is, since he's supposed to be 2.5 feet tall. Because of this, I also use liquid green stuff to add the first layer of green stuff rather than adding on some of the putty. Once that liquid green stuff is dry, I go ahead and start building up the miniature. Here, starting by adding some more green stuff to the torso. Once that's at a place where I like it, I can start adding some of the details. Here, I add a little kind of triangular belt type thing that this miniature has, sculpting that into shape with my round rubber sculpting tool. For those of you who don't know, this is one of the tools that I tend to use the most for this kind of a thing. I then go ahead and use a needle to sculpt some folds into what will be the shirt. Next up, I start working on the jacket that the character is wearing, starting by adding on some green stuff to create the part of the jacket that is going to be directly attached to the torso. And once I have that where I like it, I add in some wires for what is going to be the tail of the coat. I think it's called a tail. Whatever, the big flowy bit. Covering those wires with a layer of liquid green stuff. Once the wires are firmly in place and the liquid green stuff is dry, I add a little bit more green stuff to finish the coat, making sure that the transition with what I've already sculpted is as seamless as possible. And while that is setting, I go ahead and add the collar of the jacket, which is this, not a traditional collar necessarily. It kind of goes around the back of the coat and then pops up, as you can kind of see here as I'm sculpting it. I then go in with a tiny little piece of green stuff to create a bit of a cravat, sculpting that into the shape that I'm looking for using a needle. After that, I can start finishing the coat, so I add some more green stuff around the sleeves, trying to hide any seams between the green stuff that has already dried and the green stuff that I'm adding. I then go ahead and give the coat some cuffs and add a little bit of furly material for the shirt underneath. And now with the coat finished, I can move on to work on the boots, adding a little bit of a folded down part of the boot to start off with, to act as an indication of where the boot starts and the leg ends, as well as making sure to get the right amount of green stuff onto his foot to make the main part of the boot. While the rest of the miniature sets, although it is not particularly well filmed, I start working on the face. My main two focuses for this face was firstly to make it look human because of how tiny it's going to have to be, but what I was also hoping to try and accomplish was add a little bit of emotion and expression to the face. This character that I'm sculpting is a fairly kind of charismatic, cocky character, so I wanted to give him a kind of like a little bit of a grin. But I'll be getting to that later once that armature for the face sets. While I wait for it to set, I start working on the hands, and so this character often uses finger guns to shoot lightning, so that's what I'm going to try to attempt with these hands. And once I have those hands where I like them, I can move on and work on the lightning that is going to be shooting out of said hands. And if you're interested to know how I sculpt and paint lightning, I have a video where I do that, as well as how to sculpt and paint fire. So if you want a more in-depth look into how to do that kind of stuff, you can check out my video that should be in the card right about now. Now I go back to the face that I was working on. Now that the armature has set, I can start working on some of the details. Once again, as I mentioned earlier, I was trying to give him kind of like a grin of sorts, and some of the things that I'm keeping in mind while I try to get that expression on his face is mostly how the cheeks and eyes are going to be affected by the grin. Once I've finished the face, I move on to do the hat, starting by sculpting some large flamboyant feathers for it. And when I go to sculpt the brim of my hat, I actually do that on the handle of my craft knife, so that it's going to be a little bit curved. With the face now finally set, I go to add that onto the miniature, and then take a nice long break to wait for the hat that I was working on to set as well. Go ahead and poke a little bit of a hole into the hat that I was working on, and fit that around the head of the miniature. And then I add a little bit more green stuff to make the kind of main part of the hat. Once that's where I like it, I move on to give the miniature some hair, being sure to give him some nice, luscious, flowing locks. I then go back to the feathers that I sculpted earlier, and then go ahead and attach those to the hat with a little bit more green stuff. And unfortunately, I got a little bit ahead of myself and forgot to film the turnaround with just the green stuff, but here is the mini now that it's primed. I go ahead and paint all of the base colors, doing the coat in a blue, and then coloring in the rest of the miniature with some browns and whites. Save for the feathers, which I add a little bit of a pastel pink. With all of the base coats in, I start working on the shadows, getting some watered down paint into the crevices of the cloak and then blending them in with a dry brush. I then also do the same thing but with the highlights, going in with a slightly lighter blue and then blending those in again with the dry brush to create a nice gradient. I then go and paint in some facial hair on the miniature, and then I can go on to do the washes. First one being a reddish brown wash that I do on all of the flesh tone to stain the slightly yellowish flesh tone I added more red. I then take some time to paint in the eyes very carefully, and then go over the entirety of the miniature with a brown wash, which does a good job of creating some nice shadows, as well as making the miniature a little bit dirtier, like he's been on the road for a couple days. With the washes finished, I then move on to paint the lightning, starting with a base coat of white, and then once it's dry, adding a little bit of a dry brush of a light blue. This again I cover in my video on how to paint and do lightning. Taking that same light blue, dry brushing it on the miniature, doing a little bit of OSL, which again I explain in my video on the topic. But once I finish that, the miniature is finished. This project was difficult to say the least. Having to fit all of those details in such a small little miniature was not easy to say the least. But doing something on such a small scale was definitely an interesting challenge. Overall, it was a fun miniature to do, and I think it turned out rather well. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you enjoyed this kind of mini-series that I'm doing sculpting these characters. If you have any advice or any tips that you would like to give me, or any questions in miniatures you're sculpting yourself, please leave them in the comments below. And also don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to get notified of whenever I release a new video. Anyways, once again, thank you so much for watching that video, and I'll see you in the next one.